1, go.
You're only supposed to blow... It's so terrible. You're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off, which is pretty indistinguishable from...
You're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off.
Hello everybody and welcome to a really nostalgic number 27 edition here. We have two amazing cars and quite rightly they hark back to The Italian Job, like a film that certainly here in the UK is pretty much legendary. So I thought it'd be really fun today to have a deeper look at both of these cars. Obviously they were both featured in the film, and according to some sources, Alfa were actually quite disgruntled that it showed the Mini in a much better light and it showed them outpacing the Alfa Giulia, which at the time it was in a completely different league in terms of price as well. So today I want to do a few things. I'm going to tell you about each car and why in a way both are so revolutionary and so special. So I'm going to take them for a drive as well, see if it's really true that the Mini could have outpaced the Giulia at the time. And then lastly, we're going to talk about values. Which one is more likely to appreciate in value in the future? Both these cars were launched at the end of the 50s. Well, I guess actually the Giulia was in 62, but the Mini it was 59. Why is this car so special and why is it so important? Well, it really started the whole trend for the cars that we see today. Why is that? Well, at the time, there was nothing of this size that had the same amount of room inside. This can legitimately more or less fit for adults in a tiny little package. How did they manage that? Two things that were very unusual at the time. First of all, instead of having the engine in line, they made it transverse. So that obviously takes up a lot less packaging at the front. And as part of doing that, it obviously suited a front drive layout. That in turn meant that you didn't have a prop shaft going to the back, so that gave the rear passengers much more room. They also had a very unique suspension system, loads of other things. The way they were built was quite new. They were built on jigs, and obviously look at that design. They're just fantastic looking cars. Something else that Minis are known for is the amazing racing heritage, something that they weren't really designed for, but at the time being front wheel drive actually gave it some real advantages. In 1961 it was entered in the Monte Carlo Rally, and although it didn't absolutely shine, because it was in standard spec, there wasn't the Cooper yet, we'll get onto that in a second, it was noted how in the icy conditions it had amazing composure, stability and grip compared to the rear-wheel drive cars that were going all over the place. So that gave John Cooper, an idea, and between 1964 and I think 1968 or 67, I think the Mini was re-entered in Cooper guise, and it actually won I think 3 out of those 4 years. It had several upgrades, chief of which was the engine. I think in standard format they put out 42 horsepower, but with the Cooper spec it went up to 72 horsepower. Now the early cars, so those early John Cooper-esque cars, they are worth an absolute fortune. The car that you see here today, still worth good money, but they are slightly more affordable, and this is the 90s sort of reboot by Rover. Still looks exactly the same as it did then, apart from the flared arches, but obviously the engine is fuel injected, it's got a few things to keep it up to date, but essentially it is still that Mini. We'll talk about the values a bit later. And now to the Giulia. Now Alfa Romeo, as it has been perennially throughout its history, was actually in trouble when it designed this car. They really needed to come up with something that would take them out of the doldrums and the financial problems that they were having. The Giuliettas that came before were really successful cars for Alfa Romeo in terms of numbers, but they needed something to be a bit more mass market, but at the same time retain those special Alfa Romeo qualities. So they came up with the 105 series cars. Now the chassis was actually used for the saloon, it was also used for the coupe, which I owned, and for the Spider versions of these cars. So Alfa did make hay with this chassis, but really importantly, this was a massive step forward at the time compared to other saloons that you had. So it had an engine which had twin overcam heads. Had an engine which had twin overhead camshafts. It was an all alloy engine. It had disc brakes all round. It had a 5-speed gearbox, and crucially, it had a CD So that's the aero measure of 0.34, which at the time was amazing, and it allowed the Giulias, although it's just a 1.6 and about just over 100 horsepower, to reach 112 miles an hour, which for the time was incredible. Most other saloons topped out at about 90. So it was actually quicker than most sports cars. And you know, if nowadays you wonder why Alfa has that special name, because you see the modern saloons, and okay, some of the stuff now is quite nice, but they went through the doldrums a little bit, and you wonder, why does it have that halo? Well, it's because of cars like this. At the time, they really were technically over and above everything else. Forget the rust thing, it didn't figure in those days. These cars were just technically so advanced. These minis, not ideally suited to someone 6'1" or whatever I am. I've been in a mini before, but I couldn't remember my knees being quite so close to the wheel. The other thing that you have is it's a real sort of deep, you know, it's a leaning forward dish, which makes the Ferrari look like the wheel is placed quite well, my 308 that is. But on the plus side, God, they are just brilliant. I thought these later cars, because they have the big flares, so they have the really wide wheels and tyres, which I think was really primarily an aesthetic thing. These were released again in the early 90s and, you know, just made them look tough, you know, with the little sort of flared arches and everything. But I thought it would have ruined the way that they handled, and I haven't driven an original Cooper S in a long time, but all I can say is that this one is just, yes, it has a bouncy ride, but it is so much fun. It seems to really grip onto the road. Turns on a sixpence. You get so much feel from the steering. It's just amazing. I mean, they're such incredible little cars. And these later ones have these sort of wood veneer dashes with the instruments which are updated, which don't quite look, they don't look quite right, I think, in the cold light of day now, compared to the classic cars. But there's just no denying that they are brilliant, brilliant things. In terms of power, not a huge amount. This has a bit more of a peppy engine, but in actual fact, it has a slight misfire above 4,000, so I'm not able to rev it, so I can't really take any advantage of that. But it is still pretty quick down a country road, it really is. Now the low speed, actually not the low speed ride, the small frequency bumps as well, it handles really, really well. But anything above like a tiny bump, it just almost just doesn't deal with at all. So you do get quite a bumpy ride, but it's not unpleasant. Now if we're talking about values, there's quite a big disparity. So the original Cooper S's from the 60s, they go for anything from sort of, you know, 20 to 50,000 pounds. The later cars, like this one, basically are more akin to, well, you can find what I assume must be sheds for about 6,000, but I think a decent car, a car like this one, you would be looking for something in the region of, I don't know, between 50 and 20,000, which for a Mini is quite a lot of money. They were made in massive numbers as well, that's the other thing to consider, but I think it's a testament to the design, how incredible, groundbreaking the design was, and how good they look. That despite the numbers of them that are around, they still command pretty much the same sort of value as that Giulia that we're going to be driving in a minute. Now don't forget, this has basically still an A-series engine, although it's a late car. They basically just updated it with injection and other bits and bobs. But it is really just a pushrod engine. Compare that to the Alfa, which at the time already had overhead camshafts, it was all alloy. It was way, way ahead of this technically, but as a, you know, if you think that all the front drivers that we have now, they basically all descended from the Mini. Transverse engine, front wheel drive, packaging genius from Isignois, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the designer of the Mini. the way it handles the twisties and stuff, I was a bit skeptical, but of course, you know, it was only a film, and I was, as I said, I was a bit skeptical, but in the right environment, I'm pretty sure it could outrun the Giulia. Even just when I was coming up to this road for filming, and my friend Chris, who has the Giulia, was following me, I could see that even with this sort of only going up to 4,000 revs, so I wasn't able to get all the power out of it. You know, every now and again, it was certainly, you know, it looked like the Alfa was sort of having its work cut out in keeping up. If you only drive the modern stuff, you're just missing out. With these cars, this is so different, from example, to anything else that I've driven, the way this car feels. And, oh, tried to double declutch there, but it didn't work. And the modern stuff instead, it just all feels the same. It is a shame the engine doesn't rev out, because I would love to have a proper go on this one. But still, love it. Really, really. All the fuss about minis, justified. It actually feels like a much older car than the Mini straight off, which is quite odd. It definitely feels bigger, much more ponderous. It hasn't got the direct feel, but God, it feels like quality. This is an aftermarket wheel, but it's so nice to hold. The sort of lacquered finish on them is great. The interior is really nice, and the steering again. I don't know how to say. I'm just not a good enough motoring journalist, but these cars, in a different way, both have amazing steering. This is not as sharp off centre as the Mini. The Mini off centre is really sharp. This has a bit more slop, also because it leans more. So when you turn, it doesn't immediately respond, also because the car sort of just leans with each turn. This does give a much better ride. It just feels like a much more grown-up car. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, this has a 5-speed gearbox. In, you know, at the end of the 60s, that was a really big deal. It feels nice and solid. There aren't many rattles in here. I love it. Really nice, and a completely different experience to the Mini. It definitely feels much more grown up. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that on this particular road, which is amazing, it's just not as much fun as the Mini. It just doesn't have that immediacy of response. But God, if you had to have a classic as a daily, you could definitely have this as a daily. It rides really well. The steering is just, I don't know, it's got a fluidity about it, which is just lovely. Going from one bit of travel to the other, it just feels oiled. I don't know how to describe it to you. It's different to the Mini. It's not as quick, but oh my God, it is amazing. I love it, absolutely love it. Now, in terms of power, even though that Mini was a little bit like limited, because I don't know what's happening up at the top of the rev range, this does feel a little bit slower, and I think it's just because it's a heavier car. It doesn't have the same sort of sprightly feel as the Mini. But you can imagine at the time, you know, when the saloons were so backwards, this must have felt like a rocket ship. Gearbox is quite long throw, but really nice to use, easy to use. All the controls are at hand. Obviously you've got a lot more room than the Mini. It is much more comfortable, handles the bumps a lot better, and it is so nice round corners. This does have a bit of an advantage. It has a handling pack, I think it's the Alfaholics handling pack, so it's got, the suspension has been sorted, and it really shows. It's nice and tight. And yeah, it does roll around more than the Mini. It's just a different kind of driving. Now, in terms of values, again, you can get a shed one of these. You used to be able to pick them up for absolutely nothing. They weren't worth anything. The coupes, 105 series coupes, they were always worth money. But these, they were never really, you could get like a decent one if you go back 10-15 years ago for around 3,500, 5,000 would get you a top saloon, a really top saloon. That's when the coupes were around, a good coupe was around the 10,000 mark. They have, though, in the last few years really shot up in value, and that's because there have been a series of hot rod versions of these that just look brilliant. And people have just started appreciating them. So now, really, to get a good one of these, I think you're probably going to be looking at 15,000. It is, again, in the same ballpark as that Rover Mini. But which one of the two do we think is actually going to appreciate more over time? It's a really hard call to make. On the one hand, the Mini, what does it have against it? Well, in many ways, it's a much more agricultural car. It's not as refined as this. It was much, much cheaper at the time. It was never designed as an expensive car, whereas this was at the top end of the market. This is much more capable. The engineering, is fantastic. However, the Mini was way ahead of its time and much more groundbreaking, really, than this is. And it has that incredible Mini look. And so, I don't know what to tell you. A lot less of these were made. They have already appreciated a lot. With the Mini, it is a very special, groundbreaking car. If it had to be me, I think I would get the Giulia, just because it's more usable and because as a thing, it's nicer. The interior is nicer. Some of the stuff is quite jewel-like, and I just love the looks. But that is nothing against the Mini at all, because the Mini itself is just, in terms of driving fun, the Mini totally has this licked. This is really good. This is really good. But the Mini just has it licked. But this is just more usable. It's a more everyday car. It's more grown up. It just feels, like it's more quality than the Mini is, which might surprise you about an Alfa, but really they were quality. It was just a shame that the rust got in the way, because they were actually good quality cars and they were well engineered. I absolutely love this, and I would love to have one, I have to say. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jane, for lending me the cars for today. And yeah, whichever one you decide to buy, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Just make sure that you know what you're after so that you buy it for the right reason. But you won't be disappointed with either. They are brilliant cars. Thank you so much for watching. Please do follow me on Instagram if you haven't yet, and please do subscribe if you haven't as well. See you for the next video.